The screen flickers to life. Black and white film reels stutter across the frame. The Hollywood of the 1930s glows in silver light. Gowns trailing across marble floors, flashbulbs exploding, the sound of reporters shouting for a statement. Among the crowd of glamorous actresses, one woman stands apart. Tall, sharp-eyed, dressed not in a sequined gown, but in a pair of slacks and a simple blouse. She walks past the cameras without a smile, without hesitation. Her name is Katharine Hepburn. She would become one of the most decorated and enigmatic figures in film history. Over the course of 60 years, Hepburn would redefine what it meant to be a leading lady. She won 4 Academy Awards, still a record for any actor, and starred in films that shaped the very language of American cinema. Bringing Up Baby, The African Queen, The Philadelphia Story, The Lion in Winter, and On Golden Pond. Yet, for all her fame, there was something the world could never quite grasp about her. She was an open book on screen, witty, brilliant, fearless, but in real life, she built a wall that no one could climb. In an era when every star's love life was meticulously packaged and sold by studio publicists, Katharine Hepburn refused to play along. She gave few interviews, avoided publicity, and rarely appeared at Hollywood parties. While other actresses were photographed draped on the arms of powerful men, Hepburn walked alone. When asked about romance, she would shrug and say, "I'm married to my work." And that became her legend, the independent woman who didn't need anyone. But beneath that defiant independence lay a silence that fascinated generations. Was it solitude by choice? Or protection against a world that demanded conformity? The old Hollywood machine ran on image. Every smile, every scandal, every wedding, staged for the cameras. Women were told who to date, when to marry, what to say. The studios decided who you were. But Katharine Hepburn refused to let them decide for her. She cut her own hair, wore trousers, spoke with an unmistakable Connecticut accent that critics called arrogant. Yet that defiance wasn't arrogance, it was authenticity. She lived the way she wanted to live, in a time when women weren't supposed to want that much freedom. As the decades went on, her legend grew, and so did the mystery. Reporters whispered that there was more to her private life than the public knew. Deeper attachments, unspoken loves, a hidden side that never made it into print. But Hepburn never confirmed or denied anything. She lived her life like a locked diary, every page guarded, every secret deliberate. Her closest friends called her loyal and deeply affectionate, but even they admitted she kept the core of herself hidden. And maybe that's why she continues to captivate us. Hollywood has always been obsessed with labels, with clarity, with answers. But Katharine Hepburn was the opposite. She was a question. Who was she, really, when the cameras stopped rolling? Was she simply the bold, modern woman she portrayed, or someone far more complicated? A woman protecting not just her heart, but her truth. As the camera lingers on her face, that confident, knowing smile, the question remains suspended in the air. Was her solitude a sign of strength, or of secrets the world wasn't ready to hear? This is the story of a woman who lived without compromise. A story of fame, rebellion, and a private life Hollywood could never quite explain. This is Katharine Hepburn. She was born on May 12, 1907, in Hartford, Connecticut. But even from birth, Katharine Hepburn didn't belong to an ordinary world. Her childhood home was filled with arguments, debates, and radical ideas that would have scandalized polite society. Her father, Dr. Thomas Norval Hepburn, was a physician who crusaded for public health awareness and birth control education, issues few men dared to discuss. Her mother, Catherine Martha Hepburn, was even more outspoken. A suffragist, a feminist, and one of the founders of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. Together, they raised their 6 children to think freely, speak boldly, and never apologize for being different. While other girls of the early 1900s were taught to smile, curtsy, and remain silent, Katharine was climbing trees, diving into icy rivers, and speaking her mind at the dinner table. She once said, "My parents were very modern. They didn't think children should be seen and not heard." That freedom gave her confidence, but it also came with a cost. In 1921, when she was just 13 years old, Katharine's world shattered. Her beloved older brother, Tom, was found dead, hanging by a bedsheet in the attic of a friend's house. It was ruled an apparent suicide. Katharine discovered the body herself. The shock changed her forever. For years, she refused to speak of it, and some biographers believe the trauma marked the rest of her life. In her grief, she even began calling herself Jimmy or Tom, adopting her brother's name as if to keep him alive. It was her way of holding on to him, but it also marked the beginning of her lifelong resistance to traditional notions of femininity. From that point on, she didn't just reject the expectations of women, she redefined them. She cut her hair short, wore trousers long before it was fashionable, and moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her family encouraged her independence. Her father pushed her into sports, teaching her tennis, swimming, and golf, not as hobbies, but as disciplines. Her mother reminded her that a woman could be as strong as any man. Katharine believed it completely. When she enrolled at Bryn Mawr College, she was already a young woman shaped by loss and conviction. Bryn Mawr, one of the few elite women's colleges of its time, was the perfect stage for her defiance. At first, she struggled. She was restless, uninterested in the academic routine, even suspended for poor attendance. But over time, the school became a crucible for her mind. She studied history and philosophy, disciplines that sharpened her intellect and deepened her sense of individuality. And it was there, on the small campus stage, that she discovered her calling, acting. Acting, for Hepburn, was not about fame or glamour. It was about control over the story, the emotion, and the truth of a moment. On stage, she could transform, escape, and command attention on her own terms. She wasn't interested in playing docile women or pretty ornaments. Even as a student performer, she chose strong, difficult, complex roles. The audience might not always have liked her, but they could never ignore her. Graduating in 1928, Katharine Hepburn left Bryn Mawr armed with intellect, ambition, and an unshakable belief in herself, qualities that would both empower and isolate her for decades to come. The path to Hollywood would not be easy. Her voice was unusual, crisp, patrician, and commanding. Her personality intimidated producers. Yet there was something magnetic about her, a kind of raw truth that couldn't be trained away. Friends and teachers described her as fearless, but it wasn't fearlessness that drove her. It was grief transmuted into strength, defiance forged from pain. Losing her brother had stripped away her illusions about safety and belonging. From that moment forward, she refused to let anyone dictate how she should live, dress, or love. By the time she set foot on a film set, Katharine Hepburn had already done what few women in the 1920s dared. She had built a life centered on her own will. In a world that told women to fit in, she had already chosen to stand apart. When she finally arrived in Hollywood, reporters expected another ingenue with big eyes and a soft voice. Instead, they met a storm, a woman too sharp, too intelligent, too unyielding for their comfort. She didn't just break the mold. She burned it. When Katharine Hepburn first arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, the city was a dream factory wrapped in sunlight and secrecy. Young women poured in from every corner of the country, all chasing stardom under the watchful eyes of studio bosses who shaped not just their careers, but their very identities. They were told how to speak, how to dress, and even who to love. But from the moment Hepburn stepped onto a soundstage, it was clear that she was not like the others. Tall, sharp-boned, and self-assured, she carried herself more like a scholar than a starlet. She didn't flirt with the press or pose coyly for photographers. She was 25 years old, unknown, and already behaving as if the world owed her nothing, and that confidence caught Hollywood's attention. Her first film, A Bill of Divorcement, 1932, opposite John Barrymore, was an immediate success. Audiences were captivated by her naturalness, that rare combination of intelligence and emotional restraint. Critics called her performance electric, and RKO Pictures saw in her the next great leading lady. Just a year later, she won her first Academy Award for Morning Glory, 1933. She was the kind of actress Hollywood hadn't seen before, not a bombshell or an ingenue, but a woman who looked like she belonged in charge. The studios expected her to play the game, smile, attend premieres, charm gossip columnists. Instead, she refused interviews, declined fan mail, and appeared in public wearing trousers. That simple act, choosing comfort over glamour, became an act of rebellion. Reporters called her boyish and odd, while some studio heads considered her a liability. She didn't care. Katharine Hepburn wasn't chasing celebrity, she was chasing truth. But the industry thrived on illusion. By the mid-1930s, her string of box office disappointments, Sylvia Scarlett, Bringing Up Baby, and others, began to worry the studios. Though now regarded as classics, these films were misunderstood at the time. The public didn't know what to make of a woman who was too clever to be a damsel and too self-sufficient to need rescuing. The fan magazines that once celebrated her brilliance turned on her, labeling her difficult and arrogant. In 1938, the motion picture industry took an unprecedented step. A group of theatre owners published an infamous list naming actors whose films consistently lost money. The title across the top read, "Box Office Poison." Among the names, Marlene Dietrich, Joan Crawford, and Katharine Hepburn. For most stars, such a label meant exile. For Hepburn, it was fuel. She walked away from Hollywood, retreated to the New York stage, and began to rebuild her career from the ground up. There, on Broadway, she rediscovered her creative freedom. While her peers played the Hollywood game to survive, Hepburn did something unheard of. She took control of her own narrative. She starred in Philip Barry's play The Philadelphia Story, and when it became a hit, she made a strategic move that proved her brilliance. Using her inheritance money, she bought the film rights. Then she sold them to MGM on one condition, that she would star in the movie version. It was a masterstroke. The Philadelphia Story, 1940, became one of the decade's biggest hits and won her a new Academy Award nomination. Overnight, Katharine Hepburn went from box office poison to box office gold. The film cemented her image as the sophisticated, witty, untouchable woman, a character who mirrored her real-life persona almost too perfectly. But behind that triumph was a subtle irony. Her screen image, the independent woman who didn't need love, became her shield. Hollywood adored her strength but never understood its source. While the studios celebrated her comeback, she continued to live by her own rules. She didn't attend the parties, didn't court the tabloids, and never answered the one question reporters always asked, "Who does Katharine Hepburn love?" That silence became part of her legend. The more she refused to explain herself, the more the world speculated. To the public, she was an icon of self-sufficiency, a woman who defied the need for a man. To her peers, she was a force of nature, fiercely private, and utterly untamable. Hollywood, a place built on archetypes and facades, didn't know what to do with someone like her. They couldn't label her, so they mythologized her. To them, she was a contradiction. Too masculine for a leading lady, too brilliant for a romantic. But to herself, she was simply honest. She wasn't playing a role anymore. She was living the life she chose. And as the 1940s began, Katharine Hepburn was ready for her next act. One that would bind her to another Hollywood legend, in a partnership that blurred the line between performance and reality. When Katharine arrived in Hollywood, she didn't just break the mold, the narrator whispers over fading light. She burned it, and from the ashes, she built herself anew. In old Hollywood, secrets weren't whispered, they were managed. The 1930s through the 1950s were an era when image meant survival, and the studios were the gatekeepers of both. They crafted illusions with precision, the perfect marriage, the charming bachelor, the smiling ingenue. But beneath that lacquered surface, the real lives of many stars told a quieter, more complicated truth. For women, the rules were especially cruel. A single rumor could end a career. Same-sex relationships weren't just frowned upon, they were unthinkable, criminalized, and censored out of existence. So, many women built parallel worlds of their own, private circles where affection and honesty could exist beyond the camera's gaze. They called them friendships. Hollywood called them companions. But inside those bonds, a kind of freedom bloomed that couldn't be spoken of in magazines or interviews. Katharine Hepburn moved through this world with deliberate grace. She had no patience for gossip or conformity, and her personal life remained impenetrable. By the early 1930s, she had already begun to defy the studio system's idea of what a woman should be. She wore slacks on studio lots, refused to wear makeup when she didn't feel like it, and lived alone, or, more accurately, lived the way she wanted to. Her closest companion during that period was Laura Harding, a woman from a wealthy New Jersey family who had been with her since her early days on stage. Harding wasn't just a friend, she was a constant presence, traveling with Hepburn, living in her home, sharing her day-to-day life. When reporters questioned it, Hepburn brushed them off with that sharp wit of hers. "Laura's my best friend. She does everything I don't want to do. She's my right hand." But to those who saw them together, the connection seemed far deeper than friendship. They shared a home in Connecticut for nearly 6 years. Harding accompanied her to film sets, premieres, and even vacations. Together, they crafted a kind of domestic partnership that Hollywood didn't have language for. There were no declarations, no labels, only loyalty. To understand what this meant in the context of 1930s Hollywood is to understand how brave it was. Studios at the time were obsessed with controlling their stars' images. Agents and publicity departments carefully curated romantic stories for every leading lady. Some were even paired off with men by contract. Studio romances meant to keep the public believing in traditional love stories. For a woman like Hepburn, who refused all of it, independence was both her armor and her disguise. Behind the camera, though, there was a quiet network of women like her. Writers, editors, and actresses who found solace in one another. From Garbo and Dietrich to Mercedes de Acosta, the industry was filled with women whose lives were edited to fit a heterosexual fantasy. In interviews, they became lonely career women. In reality, many of them had built private worlds where love looked different, quieter, safer, coded. Hepburn never commented publicly on her relationships, and she guarded her privacy like it was her final performance. When asked why she wasn't married, she once quipped, "I was born a man's daughter and I've been busy ever since." The humor was disarming, but behind it lay a truth she rarely acknowledged. She had no interest in being defined by any man. Historians and biographers have since noted the pattern in her relationships. Deep, sustaining bonds with both men and women, but an aversion to conventional romance. She lived by her own emotional logic, one that didn't fit the Hollywood script. Laura Harding wasn't the only important woman in her life, but she represented something essential. The ability to be completely seen by someone without having to explain yourself. As the years passed, Hepburn's image hardened into legend. The independent woman, the untouchable icon. But the real Katharine lived in quiet defiance of that image. She loved fiercely, just privately. She built her life in a world that punished authenticity and yet somehow managed to remain entirely herself. In later years, she would form her famous companionship with Spencer Tracy, a relationship that became Hollywood's favorite myth of enduring love. But long before that, Hepburn had already written her own definition of intimacy, one that didn't require validation, ceremony, or explanation. The narrator's voice lowers now, reflective. In a world where every touch was photographed, Katharine chose to love in the shadows, where no one could rewrite her story. She didn't need the world to understand her. She only needed it to leave her alone. Fade out to a montage, black and white photographs of Hepburn and Laura Harding laughing in the garden, walking arm in arm down a New York street, the world around them pretending not to notice. For once, the camera lingers, not on the actress, but on the woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. Hollywood in the 1930s was a machine built on illusion, a shimmering dream factory that controlled not just what people saw on screen, but what they believed about the stars who lived within it. Every romance, every heartbreak, every wedding and divorce was a script in its own right, carefully written by publicists, editors, and studio heads who understood one truth better than anyone. Image was profit. For a woman, that image was everything. The studio system demanded glamour, obedience, and heterosexual perfection. If an actress was seen as too independent, too masculine, too private, the system found a way to soften her. They paired her with male co-stars, arranged public dates, or, in some cases, created entire marriages on paper. It wasn't just about selling tickets, it was about maintaining the illusion that Hollywood's goddesses were desirable to men and safely conventional. This practice of managing scandals was an open secret. Greta Garbo, that enigmatic Swedish star, famously refused interviews and romantic publicity. She lived largely in seclusion, sharing much of her life with women like Mercedes de Acosta, a relationship Hollywood refused to acknowledge. Marlene Dietrich, bold and magnetic, lived more openly, surrounding herself with both men and women but refusing to label her loves. Yet the press spun her image as the ultimate seductress, transforming truth into titillation. Katharine Hepburn watched all of this carefully. She understood that in Hollywood, visibility was vulnerability. If you gave them even a fragment of your private life, they would devour it, reshape it, and sell it back to you as scandal. So she built something stronger than secrecy. She built a myth. Her public persona was brilliant in its precision. The lone wolf, the New England spinster, too intelligent and self-contained for domesticity. When asked about romance, she turned it into comedy. "I'd have been a terrible wife," she'd say. "I can't cook, I can't sew, and I like to be alone." She claimed her only true marriage was to her work. And in the rigid world of 1940s Hollywood, that story gave her a kind of sanctuary. The studio press called her cold or asexual, unable to understand a woman who didn't live through men. What they didn't see, or chose not to, was that this armor was intentional. Hepburn's detachment wasn't emptiness, it was self-defense. By refusing to participate in the game, she rendered herself untouchable. Behind the curtain, the studios continued their relentless image-making. For women like Garbo, Dietrich, Barbara Stanwyck, or even Joan Crawford, rumors of unconventional love lives were dangerous currency. Studio publicists worked overtime to erase or redirect suspicion, inventing romances, staging photographs, or pairing actresses with eligible men for appearances. Behind every red carpet smile was a strategy: maintain the illusion or risk exile. Hepburn's genius was that she opted out entirely. She refused the rules, refused to belong to anyone's story but her own. When gossip columnists speculated about her relationships, she starved them of material. She didn't attend parties, she ignored fan magazines, and she declined to play the Hollywood social game that defined her peers. To the public, this made her an anomaly. To the studios, she was both a risk and an asset. Too famous to control, too intelligent to dismiss. Her privacy became her fortress. And within that fortress, she was free to live as she pleased, quietly, deliberately, without explanation. Whether her solitude masked heartbreak, intimacy, or a private truth that the era couldn't yet name, no one could ever say for certain. That was the point. The voiceover slows, reflective, as if turning the camera inward. They called her cold because she didn't smile for their headlines. They called her strange because she didn't belong to anyone. But maybe she was only doing what every woman in that world dreamed of, protecting her truth from the hands that would twist it. For many women in that era, survival required performance. Some married men they didn't love. Others hid their partners in the shadows of friendship. And some, like Hepburn, created an identity so independent that the question of romance became irrelevant. By the late 1940s, she had perfected her image, not as a seductress, not as a wife, but as an ideal of female self-reliance. Her defiance wasn't just artistic, it was existential. She lived in a time when a woman could lose everything for the wrong rumor. And yet, somehow, she remained untouchable, a star who could not be defined, no matter how much Hollywood tried. The montage shifts, newspaper headlines, fan magazine covers, images of glamorous couples at premieres, all illusions. Then, a cut to Hepburn, walking briskly down a studio lot, slacks swaying, eyes fixed forward. In a town built on fantasy, the narrator continues softly, Katharine Hepburn created the most radical illusion of all, a woman who didn't need one. The camera fades to black and white footage of her sitting by a window, reading, alone but never lonely. The Hollywood dream glitters outside, but inside, there's something rarer: peace. When the lights of the MGM lot caught the gleam of Katharine Hepburn's eyes across from Spencer Tracy in Woman of the Year, 1942, something electric flickered on screen. Their chemistry felt effortless, spontaneous, even fated. Hollywood called it magic. The public called it love. And from that moment forward, their names were linked for the rest of their lives. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy would go on to make 9 films together over 25 years, a cinematic partnership that seemed to blur the line between fiction and reality. In Adam's Rib, they argued like husband and wife. In Pat and Mike, they teased and sparred with affection that looked unscripted. To audiences, theirs was the perfect romance, a meeting of equals, fiery and tender, the embodiment of grown-up love. But behind that glow, the truth was layered, private, and perhaps more complicated than even the films they made. Tracy was, by all accounts, a troubled man, a gifted actor haunted by guilt, alcoholism, and faith. A devout Catholic, he remained married to his wife, Louise Treadwell, though they had been living apart long before Hepburn entered his life. Divorce, for Tracy, was out of the question. His religion forbade it. And so the arrangement that emerged between him and Hepburn became one of Hollywood's strangest open secrets. They were partners, emotionally, professionally, perhaps romantically, but never in name. They never married, never lived together publicly, and were rarely photographed as a couple. She often accompanied him on location under assumed names, but when the cameras turned toward her, she stepped back into the shadows. Even at his funeral in 1967, after a 26-year bond, she stayed away. "I didn't want to cause a scene," she said later, quietly. It was both an act of respect and of habit. To the world, Tracy was her great love, the only man who could match her. But to some historians, their relationship reads differently, not as a grand romance, but as a pact. Hepburn, fiercely private, found in Tracy a kind of shield. He was untouchable, a respected Catholic family man. Standing beside him allowed her to maintain her mystery while diverting attention from her own private life. He, in turn, found in her the one person who neither pitied nor preached at him. She accepted his demons without judgment. Their partnership, then, was a paradox, deeply loyal, yet deliberately obscured. Biographers describe nights spent at Tracy's bungalow near the Beverly Hills Hotel, Hepburn cooking him dinner, reading scripts aloud as he drank quietly beside her. There was tenderness there, and a shared understanding of solitude. But there was also distance. She never lived with him full-time, never inserted herself into his family's life, never demanded recognition. "He was a mystery even to himself," she once said. "I loved him, but he belonged to himself." Many of her friends saw the arrangement as one of quiet endurance. Tracy's alcoholism made him unpredictable. His bouts of depression could last for weeks. Hepburn, accustomed to control, found herself in a relationship defined by limits. She took care of him in private but remained invisible in public. In the eyes of Hollywood, this invisibility made her more romantic, the devoted woman who stood by her man. But to others, it looked like another kind of performance, one more illusion to preserve peace in a world built on appearances. Some researchers, especially in later decades, have suggested that the Hepburn-Tracy relationship also served as mutual camouflage. For Tracy, whose drinking and occasional absences from the studio raised questions, the image of a stable partnership helped keep his reputation intact. For Hepburn, who had long been the subject of rumors about her unconventional friendships and avoidance of men, the association with Tracy offered a narrative the public could accept. They gave each other what the other needed most: protection. Still, there was genuine affection. When Tracy's health began to fail in the 1960s, Hepburn cared for him at his home. She read to him, cooked for him, kept his days quiet. On the set of their final film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967, Tracy was gravely ill. The cast and crew worked around his condition, knowing it might be his last performance. Hepburn's eyes in that film, gentle, filled with restrained sorrow, tell more than any biography could. Tracy died just days after filming ended. Hepburn later said she never watched the movie again. It was too painful. Their love, if that is the word, defied convention but also never escaped it. It was both real and performative, intimate and strategic. She once described him as the most fascinating man I ever met, and perhaps he was. Yet, even as she stood beside him in spirit, she never surrendered her independence. "I was never anyone's wife," she said later. "Not his, not anyone's. I was myself." As the narrator's tone softens, the screen fades to archival photographs. Tracy on set, head bowed, Hepburn standing just behind him, her face unreadable. The voiceover continues. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was something harder to name: devotion, duty, companionship. Or maybe, in a town that demanded explanation, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy found the only kind of love that could survive, one hidden in plain sight. The music swells, soft strings, nostalgic but unresolved. The illusion of Hollywood romance fades to black, leaving only two silhouettes, a man and a woman bound not by vows or appearances, but by the unspoken understanding that in their world, truth could never be shown, only lived quietly. Long after Katharine Hepburn's death in 2003, her legend refused to rest. Her career, 4 Academy Awards, a lifetime of defiance, was settled history. But her private life, the one she fought so fiercely to protect, continued to invite speculation. Who was she, really, when the lights went out and the interviews stopped? The woman who claimed to never have been anyone's wife left behind a mystery so impenetrable that it became its own mythology. In the decades since, that mythology has grown, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes recklessly. New biographies and analyses have tried to fill the silence she left behind. Some of them, like William J. Mann's Kate, the woman who was Hepburn, explored her life with a modern lens, arguing that the patterns of her relationships and the testimonies of those close to her point toward a woman who loved freely, both men and women. Mann drew from interviews with Hollywood insiders who described Hepburn's long-term companionships and deep attachments to women like Laura Harding and the writer Frances Rich. But here lies the truth that even the most meticulous researchers can't escape. No verifiable documentation exists. No letters, no diaries, no direct confessions. The record is a patchwork of recollections, hints, and interpretations. The kind of evidence that says more about the world's curiosity than about Hepburn herself. The actress left no memoir, no scandalous autobiography, no posthumous tell-all. It's as if she knew this would happen, that the silence she built around her life would become the loudest part of her story. The fascination persists, not simply because people want to know whom she loved, but because she represents something deeper, a question about identity, secrecy, and survival in an era that punished honesty. To modern audiences, her refusal to conform feels defiant, almost heroic. To her contemporaries, it was baffling. She walked through a system that demanded women be defined by men, and she simply refused. She wasn't cruel or dismissive, she just didn't play the part. "I have no fear of death," she once said, her voice steady in an interview. "Must I fear love too?" That single sentence captures everything about her. The irony, the intelligence, the quiet ache. She feared nothing but exposure. To her, love was private, sacred, and perhaps safest when unspoken. And in a century when a woman's worth was often measured by her willingness to be claimed, Katharine Hepburn's self-possession was revolutionary. Yet, that very privacy has become the soil in which legend grows. Each generation projects its own meanings onto her. Feminists see her as the prototype of the independent woman who needed no man to define her. Queer historians read between the lines of her friendships and find echoes of love that had no place in the daylight of old Hollywood. Traditional biographers describe her as a woman of contradictions, vulnerable yet unyielding, intimate yet impenetrable. The reality may be all of these things, or none of them. Because what makes Hepburn's story endure isn't the promise of an answer, but the refusal of one. In a world addicted to confession, she kept her silence. She didn't hide out of shame, she hid out of principle. She believed that a life belonged to its owner, not to the papers, not to the studios, and not to history. Hollywood had trained the world to expect access, to demand every detail of its stars' lives. And when Hepburn denied that access, she broke the contract between celebrity and audience. She showed that mystery could be power. That not knowing could be the most radical statement of all. Today, her legacy stands at a crossroads between myth and evidence. The interviews, the letters, the speculative biographies, they all circle around the same question. What was she protecting? Some say it was her privacy, others say it was her truth. But perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply her right to be whole, to live without being reduced to a headline or a label. The narrator's tone slows, softer now, reflective. We will never know everything about Katharine Hepburn. And maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. She spent her life defying explanation, not because she was afraid of the truth, but because she believed her life belonged only to her. Archival footage fades in, Hepburn in her garden, hair grey and wild, laughing as she tends to flowers. Then a still photo from her youth, chin lifted, eyes daring the camera to guess. The voice continues. She didn't write her story in diaries or letters. She wrote it in how she lived, boldly, privately, and on her own terms. Maybe the real secret isn't who she loved, but that she never let the world tell her who she was. The scene fades to black and white. A single line of text appears on screen, one of her own. If you obey all the rules, you miss all the fun. The music swells, not mournful, but free. Because in the end, Katharine Hepburn's greatest act of rebellion wasn't her defiance of Hollywood, or love, or convention. It was her insistence that a woman could exist entirely, without explanation, without permission, and without apology. By the time Katharine Hepburn entered her later years, Hollywood had changed, but she hadn't. The studio system that once tried to tame her had collapsed, and the world had moved into color, into scandal, into openness. Yet, Hepburn remained exactly as she'd always been, private, precise, and entirely her own. In an industry that measured women by youth, she defied the very notion of expiration. Her performances in The Lion in Winter, 1968, and on Golden Pond, 1981, didn't just prove her longevity, they redefined it. Here was a woman in her 60s, then her 70s, commanding the screen with intellect, humor, and a presence that seemed untouched by time. When she stood opposite Peter O'Toole as Eleanor of Aquitaine, she wasn't playing royalty, she was it. And when she faced Henry Fonda on that quiet New England lake inn on Golden Pond, she wasn't playing an old woman. She was showing Hollywood that age could be luminous, that beauty could exist in truth. Off-screen, she became something rarer than a movie star. She became a cultural compass. Young actresses admired her not for glamour, but for nerve. She was outspoken, almost defiantly so, about aging, independence, and the absurdity of celebrity. I never realized until lately, she said, that women were supposed to be the inferior sex. She said it like a joke, but it wasn't. Even as her body began to fail, her tremor, her hoarse voice, her gradual retreat from public life, she refused pity. She gave interviews from her Connecticut home in her 80s, hair wild, eyes sharp, her words cutting through nostalgia like a knife. I don't believe in marriage, she said flatly. I've tried it. It doesn't work for me. I think people should be free. That freedom, not scandal, not rumor, was the core of who she was. She outlived nearly all her contemporaries, dying in 2003 at the age of 96, surrounded by family. Her ashes were scattered in the same Connecticut waters she had rode as a girl. She had lived through 2 world wars, the rise and fall of the studio system, and 6 decades of cinematic transformation, and she never once apologized for being herself. When asked in her final interview if she had any regrets, she said simply, "No. I had a wonderful time." And yet, after her death, her story began to take on new meanings. Different generations saw different versions of her. To film historians, she was the ultimate actor's actor, disciplined, fearless, instinctive. To feminists, she was the archetype of female independence, a woman who built a career on her own terms long before it was fashionable. To queer audiences, she became something even more powerful, a symbol of freedom from the role society demanded, of how to exist beyond labels. Her name began to appear not only in retrospectives but in queer studies, art essays, and LGBTQ+ history projects. Not because anyone had proven anything definitive about her relationships, but because of what her life represented. She blurred gender before the word androgyny was ever chic. She wore pants when women were fined for doing so in public. She refused marriage, motherhood, and subservience, not as rebellion, but as instinct. And in doing so, she created a model for authenticity that transcended sexuality, gender, and time. It's ironic, the woman who spent her life avoiding definitions has, in death, become a symbol for everyone who refuses to be defined. Some see this as projection, others see it as truth finding its form. But in either case, it speaks to her power. The world keeps rewriting Katharine Hepburn because she left it permission to. The narrator's tone turns reflective, gentle. Whether she loved men, women, or only her own wild spirit, Katharine Hepburn taught Hollywood that independence is its own kind of romance. The montage that follows is quiet, images of Hepburn through the decades, the young rebel in slacks, the mid-career icon, chin lifted, fire in her eyes, the elder stateswoman, frail but unbroken, sitting by her window in Old Saybrook. Her laugh, that unmistakable rasp, echoes faintly under the narration. Her story isn't about secrecy, the voice continues. It's about sovereignty, the right to belong only to oneself. She didn't demand love from the world. She demanded respect. And by the end, she had both. The screen fades to the closing image, Hepburn in silhouette, walking away down a path lined with trees, light catching the curve of her shoulders. The final words linger. She was never what Hollywood wanted her to be. She was always something greater, a woman no rumor could define, and no legend could contain. The music swells, slow piano, fading into silence. Then, a final quote appears in white letters over black. Life is hard. After all, it kills you. Katharine Hepburn. Fade out. The film opens in silence. Old footage, Katharine Hepburn's unmistakable laugh, sharp and unrestrained, fills the screen. Her hair is windblown, her shoulders square, her gaze direct. She's not posing, she never did. The camera catches her as she was, unedited, unafraid, unowned. The narrator begins softly, with reverence and curiosity intertwined. Perhaps we will never know whom Katharine Hepburn truly loved. But maybe that's the point. Through decades of speculation, biographies, and whispered theories, Hepburn remains a paradox, one that refuses to be solved. Her truth was her own, and she guarded it like a relic. Even in her final years, when journalists came searching for confessions, she gave them only fragments, dry wit instead of intimacy, insight instead of confession. She understood something Hollywood never could. That mystery was not absence. It was power. The montage continues, a younger Hepburn on the set of Bringing Up Baby, her eyes glinting with mischief. The quiet tenderness in The African Queen, the aged grace of On Golden Pond. Through every phase, the same essence remains, self-possession, curiosity, and that flicker of defiance that no script could teach. Her last television interview plays faintly in the background. The voice is tremulous, but the conviction is intact. I never gave anyone permission to tell me who I was, she says, almost daring the audience to disagree. That was Katharine Hepburn, a woman whose entire life was a declaration of sovereignty. She came from privilege, yes, but she reinvented privilege into something subversive, the privilege of choice. She refused to marry for appearance, refused to retire for convenience, refused to explain her heart to strangers. She wore trousers because they made sense, not statements. She disappeared from Hollywood at her peak because she wanted better roles, not attention. Every decision was radical because every decision was hers. She lived exactly as she wished, the narrator continues, without apology, without permission. For a century, the public tried to define her. Tomboy, feminist, spinster, icon, maybe even queer trailblazer. But every label feels too small. Katharine Hepburn existed before language caught up. She was the prototype of a modern woman before the world knew what to call one. Her independence was not rebellion for its own sake. It was survival. She understood that privacy was the last frontier of freedom, especially for women whose faces belonged to the public. In the final years of her life, when asked about love, she gave answers that sounded like riddles. I loved Spencer, she said once, but I was never meant to be anyone's wife. And that, like so much of her story, left room for both truth and illusion. To some, Tracy was her great love. To others, he was a companion in secrecy, a mutual shield from the world's scrutiny. Maybe both were true. Maybe neither. What remains undeniable is that she loved deeply, life, art, movement, ideas. She once said, "If you always do what interests you, at least one person is pleased." That was her creed. And perhaps, in that simple philosophy, lies the key to her legend. The camera fades between old interviews and movie clips, her laughter in the Philadelphia Story, her fierce eyes in Adam's Rib, her vulnerability in Summertime. Through it all, she seems to be speaking directly to the audience, across time. Don't ask me to explain myself. Just watch. Just listen. The voiceover slows, more reflective now. In a world that demanded confessions, she offered creation. In a culture that craved romance, she gave self-respect. And in an industry that thrived on illusion, she left behind a truth more enduring than scandal, a woman in love with her own freedom. The music swells, strings rising like memory. Clips of her Connecticut home appear. Sunlight filtering through the trees, a quiet lake, the wooden dock where she once sat with her rowing boat. The camera lingers on her old typewriter, the framed photographs, the chair she used to sit in. It feels like a shrine not to a movie star, but to a philosophy, to a woman who lived as artfully as she performed. The narration grows softer, almost like a whisper of admiration. Perhaps her greatest act wasn't on film at all. It was the life she directed when the cameras stopped rolling, the one where she wrote her own lines, cast her own fate, and refused to share the final cut. Fade to black and white stills, Hepburn's eyes behind her trademark sunglasses, the knowing smile, the half-tilt of her head. She wasn't the woman Hollywood made. She was the woman Hollywood could never make again. The final moments are quiet, her voice faintly heard from an old interview. I just did what I wanted. Isn't that the best anyone can do? Then, the closing line, a return to the narrator's calm, poetic tone. She left no diary, no confession, no map to her heart. Only a life lived with fearless honesty. And maybe, in the end, that's all the truth we ever needed. The music fades to stillness, a single image remains. Katharine Hepburn standing at the water's edge, wind catching her hair, looking out into the distance, untamed, unknowable, free. A woman in love with her own freedom. The final image of Katharine Hepburn lingers, sunlight catching the edges of her hair, the water behind her glimmering like memory. Katharine Hepburn remains the most awarded actress in Oscar history. Her story continues to inspire, not because of who she loved, but because she never let anyone decide what love should look like. In memory of a woman who lived her truth, even when she never spoke it aloud.